Good morning, everyone, and good morning to the new South Africa. The world has changed after the elections. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very grateful to be invited again. I mean, it's always you warm people, salt of the earth. So very exciting, and it's so much better to be with you than with politicians. And so on. But I think what's happening now, I thought I'll have a conversation just in terms of the country now and from where I am sitting. After the elections, I mean, we've got 14 days starting today to put a national government together. So according to South African law, they have 14 days. Now, in other countries, normally coalitions are put together sometimes in 6 months, 9 months. And so on. So we can have to try in 14 days to put a coalition one way or the other together. Now there are a couple of options. The ANC's got 40%, so it is still a very dominant organization. Now in any other country, the opposition would have now put together a coalition and put the governing party on the opposition benches. Now, this is not happening in our country because the opposition is so widely ideologically diverse. I mean, on the one hand, there's the anchor, the Democratic Alliance with a multi-party charter as the one anchor, and then you have your economic freedom fighters, populists on the left side, and your MK, also extremely popular. It's very difficult in that scenario to put together a government. I mean, so it's not impossible, but very, very difficult, right? And I'll come back to that because some countries have put together such unlikely alliances. For example, in Israel, they had, in 2021, under the Bennett prime ministership, they had such an unlikely alliance in government. Essentially, what Bennett had when he was prime minister, he had another party and two Zionist parties, and he put them in a coalition, but then they agreed not to be part of the government, the other party and the two Zionist parties, and then they would just tactically vote with the government, and so on. So one could conceive, for example, having the ANC on the benches and having a big tent governing coalition in some kind of scenario, but if one could convince the EFF and the MK not to be part of the government and to just tactically vote and not to disrupt the government or not to collapse the government. You know, that's one of the extreme scenarios. The good thing is, in a multi-party charter, I mean, I was independent chair of putting those negotiations together. We worked through all of these scenarios. I brought all of these different scenarios around the world and some of the possibilities, so they're not unprepared. They're not going into these negotiations unprepared. It was 14 days, and the clock is ticking. So that's a very extreme example of what is possible. Now, two of the more realistic examples would be the ANC forming a coalition with the economic freedom fighters and the Patriotic Alliance, and perhaps Good and Al Jamaa, because they are in government with Good at a national level, in some sort of mini coalition, and they are in coalition with Al Jamaa in Johannesburg, which is absolutely disastrous. If you compare Johannesburg to Cape Town, I would rather be staying here, and so on. So that is what we would call the doomsday scenario. I mean, you would have the ANC on the one hand, EFF plus smaller parties, and it would be, I mean, last night, Julius Malema gave his demands for to be in a coalition with the ANC or with any other party, and it is nationalization of the mines, it is land expropriation without compensation, creating more state companies, and so on and so on. So you can see why we're calling that a doomsday scenario, potentially doomsday scenario. So that's on the one hand. In the ANC, or before I get to that, that's another potentially ANC in alliance with MK and the EFF, or with MK in one or other capacity, and then some other smaller parties also. Now, I think increasingly after last night, it is very likely that such an ANC-MK scenario is not going to be very likely. Zuma has two very hard demands. I mean, one demand is that Ramaphosa must go as an exchange for MK to be in coalition with the ANC. The second one, demand is he wants a presidential pardon. In August, he's facing just under 100 charges of racketeering and corruption, so those charges are not going away. I mean, it's not like one charge, it's under 100 charges. You know, you can get away. And you can only have a Stalingrad legal strategy for so long. So, I mean, he's running out of runway to try to run away from the charges. So he needs a presidential pardon. And for him, it's key. And that's the reason why he set up MK. I don't think he is interested in joining government or being part of parliament and so on, but his key thing has been, he's been trying to get a presidential pardon out of the ANC, out of Ramaphosa. He hasn't gotten it. And he thinks by forming his own party and getting the numbers and then pressurizing the ANC, you know, sort of from a different angle, he will get it. So that's quite a big thing for him. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the ANC to agree to let Ramaphosa go, and so on. And also yesterday, I think Zuma made some really dictatorial statements which made it very difficult for the ANC even to begin to have a conversation with him. He's been saying, well, actually the elections is rigged and the elections has to be rerun and so on. It makes it very difficult for the ANC to even consider partnering with him now. So, you know, that's the one scenario. The second scenario would be, or before I get to that scenario, let me talk a little bit about the ANC. I mean, ANC is there's 14 days to put this coalition together. The ANC, with the majority, still dominant party, is in an absolute crisis. I mean, they're in a real crisis. First of the crisis is leadership crisis. Many ANC leaders, you know, the opponents of Sir Ramaphosa want him to go, want him to, I mean, they're blaming him for the loss, right? And they're looking for a scapegoat. That's the one. So in this, one of the most unprecedented negotiations in the country in the last 30 years, the ANC is with a leader without authority in the party, you know, in these tricky negotiations. So that's the first. So when you go into negotiations, sort of your lead negotiator will have to, you know, must have the credibility and the authority. So he doesn't have it at the moment. So that's really their first crisis in these negotiations. And he would prefer a coalition with the multi-party charter. When I say with a DA, IFP, and the components of the multi-party charter. So that's his own, I think his own, where he's leaning to get away from a doomsday coalition at a national level. His problem is many of his opponents, his really, really strong opponents, want to go with a coalition with the EFF. And they want to go with a coalition with the EFF because they say, if they're in a coalition with a multi-party charter or with a DA or components of the multi-party charter, they'll have to, it'll be very, very difficult for them to continue their patronage type of politics. I mean, if they imagine a coalition with a DA, can't just go make any appointments, patronage type of appointments, patronage type of procurement, and so on, because there's going to be scrutiny. If you're in a coalition with the EFF, it's quite easy. You continue with what you're doing, the sort of patronage type of policies, but you just bring in the EFF in as part of the club, part of the patronage club, right? So the groups in the ANC who fear sort of the end of patronage type of politics, the end of corruption, the end of cadre deployment, and so on, they would rather prefer a coalition with the EFF and smaller parties. You know, they love that doomsday scenario. I think it's a good thing for them from a self-interest point of view. So that's the ANC's dilemma, and as I say, I mean, it's unprecedented. It's 14 days, the clock is ticking. We have to put together a government. And we don't have a law to manage this process, and I think when the constitutional framers, when they put together, I think there wasn't the expectation that we're going to get to this sort of point, and that is why the 14 days. I mean, in late February, was asked by government I co-chaired the proposals for a law. I mean, we put it together. It was recommended to cabinet sort of mid-March, and then it wasn't introduced into Parliament. I think the reason why it wasn't introduced was perhaps the ANC thought they'll win the election over 50%, they'll get into government, and then they'll introduce a framework to guide coalitions, right? Now, they're under 50%, and we don't have a law. We don't have a framework. Right, so let me get to the multi-party charter and the DA. Where are they in the process? You know, the multi-party charter was a coalition agreement that goes all the way until the 2029 elections, not just this election, right? So the next local government elections and then the 2029 elections. There are 11 parties in the charter, and then we also have sort of parties in the periphery, sort of the MPC plus. So, I mean, the bigger parties, DA, IFP, Freedom Front Plus, Sanko in the Eastern Cape, and so on. And then there's sort of a plus component, which is sort of on the outer periphery. The idea was, if the group would get close to majority, they'll bring in the plus. You know, sort of if Boss have done better, they would have been part of the plus, or even a Rise Mazanzi, and so on. So, you know, those parties didn't do very well. A key part of the agreement, of the MPC agreement, a really, really key component is not to partner with the ANC, right? That's a key part of the agreement. The second part of it is not to partner with the Patriotic Alliance and not to partner with the EFF or with sort of MK Zuma-like type of parties, right? Okay. So in a way, they'll have to go back now with that sort of and renegotiate, because the political landscape has now dramatically changed. I'm sorry. You know, this is kind of my alarm. Now, you know, in Gauteng and in Johannesburg, the day starts at 9 o'clock. The day starts by 9 o'clock. So you know, in a new South Africa, in the coalition between the ANC and the DA multi-party charter, our day's going to start at 8 or 7. Not the 9. Up there, the other side. But so the MPC dilemma. So within the MPC group, there are parties that say, don't link up with the ANC, don't have a national or even provincial coalition with the ANC. Let him run the country. Let the voters feel what it would be under this doomsday scenario, and just oppose, right? So there is such a view from the more smaller parties, right? So the dilemma then is, if there's an opportunity to form a more common sense alliance at national and provincial level, so where provincial levels would be Gauteng, because there's no good majority, with KwaZulu-Natal, and in the Northern Cape, so those are 3 provinces. potentially to form a much more centrist, common sense coalition, DA-led multi-party charter with the ANC. So that's and all of these sort of things will have to be sorted out just about now, because there's not much time to begin, to have some negotiations. So from where I'm sitting, so now I'm giving my personal views, right? So because I can't, my personal views, the enemy is my personal views. Potentially, I would think is what is possible is to create a government of national unity. So not a traditional coalition with the ANC. So when I say sort of the DA multi-party charter, put together a government of national unity, or make a proposal for a government of national unity. So it would not be a traditional coalition. Now, in a traditional coalition, it would be parties exchange. You get into a coalition, you get this ministry, this position, and so on. I would say don't do that, right? So those type of coalitions, even the Nelson Mandela Government of National Unity was that kind of coalition. And then the Zimbabweans had a coalition like that also with Morgan Tsvangirai, with MDC, and Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF. I would say let's not do such a coalition, because the problem with such coalitions, if the dominant party is corrupt and incompetent, it drags with it the coalition partners. I mean, we've seen now with Patricia de Lille, who was part at the national level in a coalition with the ANC, and she was a minister. I mean, electorally, she was, our party's devastated. I think they only got one seat now, right? And the same happened if you remember, with IFP when they were in coalition with the ANC earlier in the 90s. I mean, IFP is still recovering from that. That their voters were confused between them and the ANC over time and began to vote for the ANC. That is why Zuma has gotten such appeal among some IFP former voters. So that's the problem, right? So what would be a government of national unity then look like? It would essentially be not to go for positions, but to go for clusters in a cabinet. So government works on clusters. So I was part of the inquiry on the professionalization of the state. The inquiry we gave, it was six, seven of us who gave, with government asked us to have a relook at the way government is organized, cabinet is organized, the way the public service organized, and we made some recommendations, which was accepted at cabinet but never implemented. So there's a potential way. So clusters with me, let's just say, the opposition would then get the financial cluster, or the agriculture cluster, or the justice cluster. So a cluster would mean, let's say, a finance cluster in cabinet. So cabinet is organized, and government is organized on clusters. So a financial cluster would be the finance department, the economic development, and potentially all the state-owned entities. So there's all collectively. And then there will be infrastructure cluster. So it's almost 2 or 3 ministries together that covers everything. All of the infrastructure, state-owned companies, all of the infrastructure departments, and so on. So to take it that way, because then the opposition can then say, well, you could actually then do reform. So what is one of the critical reforms is infrastructure in our country. I mean, that's why we're not getting the growth. There's no power, water crisis about to come, rail is not working, our ports is not working, and it really is undermining economic growth. So if in a government of national unity, the opposition parties take the infrastructure cluster, which would include all of the state-owned entities in their cluster, the rail and so on, and so on, and then have 5 years to try to change. I mean, there would also be, for example, the policing cluster. I mean, we can't have economic growth, we can't have the jobs unless we have rule of law in the country, unless the country is safer. I mean, there's just no way you can't be growth. I mean, it's an unsafe country. So if the justice, the whole cluster is taken, it would include the police, the courts, everything together, and the opposition would make all the appointments, all the cleanups, and their cluster, from the policing on the one hand to the prosecuting to the courts, and so on, would be a cluster run by the opposition. So that really, so that is totally different from a normal coalition. In a normal coalition, it is you get this ministry, John Steenhuisen will get the deputy presidency, and things like that. So you're not to do that, and then linked to. In that government of national unity, there must also be agreement on certain really toxic policies. The NHI it's a policy that may undermine, it's majorly undermine the economy. So, for example, those type of policies that have to, part of the compromise will have to be to stop those policies and relook at it. Of those sort of economic growth undermining policies and so on. So that would be the form of a government of national unity, would be a better way from what we could do in South Africa. So it's different from just exchanging positions. Now coming back, that unfortunately is the ball is almost in the ANC's courts right now because they've got the 40%, right? So, so they will have to invite the partners because they're the majority. So, because when you put a coalition together, it's the biggest party normally invite the different parties. So it is still based on the ANC, but what the multi-party charter can do is to make a really solid, good proposal for the country, in the interest of the country, of a coalition, and then have very robust negotiations. But the ANC can reject it and go and create their own doomsday scenario, and so on. As I again say from an exciting thing, how would the world look like? First, the world in a doomsday scenario world. It would be the ANC coalition in KwaZulu-Natal with the EFF, some smaller parties, and Gauteng the same, Northern Cape the same, and then nationally it's the same. I mean, I can see we would, as a country, it's a low growth option, a capital flight, skills flight. The world out there is a very uncertain world. I think we will lose development aid. I mean, just as one thing, and development aid, but many people don't understand, in South Africa is very, very important. Most of our social services, the charities that we see, are funded by foreign taxpayers, development aid, not by the state, not by the South African state. And that sector provides between 800,000 and 1.2 million jobs. So if the US pulls the plug or the EU pulls the plug, that's the kind of jobs we can lose. So I often don't understand the people that criticize our partnership with the West or with the US or with the EU. I mean, this is sort of the numbers that we're talking about, yeah. And so on. So that really is going to be a crisis. What would a government of national unity be? I think it would be a very exciting prospect. If it's put together correctly, it actually will give us that growth part that we're looking for. And it will get the confidence, and there is then a possibility to rehabilitate the country again, and to open up, to bring more skills and ideas which are now excluded in the country and bring business in. For example, I mean, it can be very important that in a negotiation, if the opposition parties negotiate to get a government of national unity, that one of the things they have to include is that business has to be accepted as a delivery institution, and the same with civil society. Because, for example, I mean, if we have a logistics crisis, but ideologically within the ANC and the EFF and MK, they don't want business anywhere close to deliver any services. It's an ideological block against business delivering, unless things have fallen down, like at the bottom. No, it's just ideological. And the strength of our country right now is that we've got still a very competitive business. We don't know how, in a doomsday scenario, what would it do with business instead of, how would it, after 5 years under doomsday scenario government. But at the moment, we really have a very strong competitive business compared to other emerging markets. And with business, we could actually turn around the country pretty quick. And the same with civil society. It's still very strong civil society. When I say civil society, I'm not just talking about people who protest civil society, but delivery civil society. I mean, in places like Johannesburg, most of the social services are delivered by civil society. I mean, the charities are actually delivering the bulk of some of the social services. So it's still very strong. That type of scenario would be, so government of national unity scenario would be the best for us.